like there's one rule for studying Chinese politics or understanding Chinese politics is that the party will do whatever the party needs to survive.
Hello and welcome back to Perspectives with Neilo. I'm your host, Neil O'Sullivan. Regular listeners to this podcast will be aware that China and the behaviour of its government, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, have been the subject of many of our past episodes. From their aggression against Taiwan and its neighbours in the South China Sea, to their questionable trade practices and the many dubious tactics they employ in their quest for global influence. In this episode, we dig a little deeper into the background and hear the perspectives of Dr. Niall Duggan, a senior lecturer in the Department of Government and Politics at University College Cork. We discuss the origins of the party, the political framework and institutions, and how things have changed under leader Xi Jinping. But first, I asked him how he would describe the current system of government in the People's Republic of China.
The current system of government is a one-party Marxist-Leninist system. That's the political system in China. So it's dominated by the Chinese Communist Party.
What are the origins of that kind of system of government? We'd associate maybe Leninist with Soviet ideology. How did that find its way to China? I know this is a big question, but maybe just briefly.
Well, I'm just to highlight, I'm not a historian, so this is not my area. So just a very broad outline was that at the during the Republican period in China, towards the end of the first decade, you had the May 4 movement, which was a protest against the settlement during the Treaty of Versailles, where a lot of Chinese, or what had been German colonial districts in China were transferred to Japan. There was nationalist protests against that, mainly led by students, and from that, you had a variety of different political organizations develop out of that, and one of them was, at the time, quite a small Marxist-Leninist group, which was then supported to some extent by the Communist Party in Russia, who sent a delegate, actually a Dutch guy, to help support the development of Marxist-Leninist thought in China, and from that you had the development of the Chinese Communist Party. One of the early members was Mao Zedong, who became one of the leaders later, but you had people like Deng Xiaoping and others part of that foundation, but they were adopting initially Marxist ideology and then later Marxist-Leninist ideology into the party.
And that Chinese Communist Party, they were founded in around 1921. How did they come to power in the PRC?
Well, they came to power in the PRC over a quite a long process, which initially was it began with a joint initiative with other groups in the state, including the Nationalist Party, where they joined together to overthrow what were referred to as the warlords who had taken over different provinces during the Republican period. And this then resulted in successful removal of the warlord groups, which then led to a civil war between the Nationalists and the Communists, which initially the Communists were losing. Then you had the Japanese invasion of China, which then led to a united front between the Nationalists and Communists again to defeat the Japanese. And once the Japanese were defeated, this resulted in a civil war between the Nationalists and the Communists again. Eventually, the Communists fled to the rural areas, and through support of the rural peasantry, eventually they managed to defeat the Nationalists, who fled to Taiwan. But that's a very, very simplified, short version of an extremely complicated period of history.
Sure, I appreciate it. And that was 1949 when they finally won that civil war.
Yeah, October 1st, yeah. was the foundation of the People's Republic of China.
And you mentioned Mao there, Mao Zedong. Many people may have heard of him. He was the leader of the CCP when the party took power in China. And some historians who talk about him mention this Maoist ideology, which was a variant of socialism. But the CCP leadership has changed over the years. You mentioned some of the other leaders there. Do you think the socialist label still makes sense when applied to China today?
Mao never referred to himself as a Maoist. That's a label that's been put on it later. Maoism is an extension of Marxist-Leninist ideology, and really it's a description of a socialist or a communist party that, rather than relying on urban workforces, relies on agrarian peasantry. So it's a way of organizing a revolution against a capitalist system, not in a industrialized society, but in an agrarian society, rather than in the imperial core, arranging it in what would be seen as a colony or the periphery. So it's a way of organizing a communist party separately. So it's very much a different way of organizing a party. And the two kind of major differences between Maoism and the form of Marxist-Leninism that was found in the Soviet Union is the concept of the United Front, which is this idea of bringing in people from within society, from other groups, not necessarily from communism, and combining that together to overthrow the state, and the idea of organizing it around the peasantry rather than the urbanized class. So that's how Maoism differs to Marxist-Leninism, but it's probably better to understand it as Marxist-Leninist Maoist. So it's not a variant of it, but it's just it's a combination of the other two, and that leads to a certain type of political structure within the party where things are organized much more flexible than it would have been organized under the Marxist-Leninist system in the Soviet Union. So you have much more experimentation. It's to do with the revolutionary or Civil War period, where groups were more distributed between the party. They were more isolated from each other, so more decision making was given to the root members of the party. And you jumped to a very complicated question at the end. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean it has. Things have changed quite a bit since those early days when Mao was in power. If we move forward to today, right?
Yeah, so we've skipped about 5 leaders.
Yeah.
In the meantime, it depends on what you mean by things have changed a lot. Do you mean in terms of the structure of the party?
Well, we hear like political commentators say that, for example, Deng Xiaoping broke dramatically with the Maoist ideology. And then coming up to today, Xi Jinping, he's become much more controlling or authoritarian domestically. So I'm just trying to get a flavour of, how it started and how it is now.
So I think part of the problem is that people tend to only look at the person at the top. So the big difference between Deng and what had come beforehand. So you had the Cultural Revolution, and there was a certain weakening of the power of the party. So Deng's big reforms were to give a greater administrative power to the state. So part of that was introduction of things like transferring of implementation of decision making more to the organs of the state rather than the organs of the party. And he introduced concepts like people shouldn't hold too many titles. Introducing a greater emphasis on kind of institutionalization of the state rather than having the party run it. But I mean, you have things like, for example, you'll see often people who comment about China in the media. They talk about term times and retirement ages, and these are like informal things that were brought in, but they weren't necessarily always applied. So like term times for the president were introduced, but there was no term times for the general secretary. So there were, or for example, Ding was never general secretary, but he was known as the preemptive leader. So the who has power and who's the leader is something that kind of Ding brought in a lot more institutionalization of transferring decision making to the state, and
but has that changed? Because what I read now is that the party has the final say on every decision, whether it's at local level or it's at government state level.
Party always had everything.
They always had it. But what was Deng Xiaoping trying to do then?
So his concept was, and again, I'm not a historian in that sense. The concept of Deng's reforms were to bring about or bring in more technical reforms, so give greater decision making to technocrats within particular areas. So it's you kind of have to understand the linkage between the party and the state, or the particular structures of it. So the party's structures are based on, you have grassroots, township or villageship or districts, depending if it's urban or rural. So you have party leaders, and then you have a state apparatus where you have township structures, and they're not necessarily the same, but they often are the same people operating in these. And then they elect people into a provincial level structure, and they elect them into the national structure. So you have the National Party Congress, for example, and they select people into the standing committees and into the proletariat, and then to the standing committee of the proletariat you elect the general secretary. And what Deng was trying to do was to create a system where you have that structure that make decisions, and they determine the overall direction, and then you have like a professional state bureaucracy that implements that. So through the state council. And what he was trying to do was to create space for new actors to come into the marketplace, for example, and to reduce the role of the party in the direct distribution of these kind of goods. So that it's the Deng's reforms were mainly economical rather than political. What happens after Deng is that you end up moving towards what's often referred to as collective leadership within the party. And that is more to do with the internal machinations of what's actually happening within the party and how they determine who's going to be in the proletariat and the central committee and the standing committee. So it's more to do with, he was trying to get the party out of the state to a certain extent and to reform the party towards what he feared was a return, perhaps like of cult of personality to a certain extent, and he wanted to move leaderships beyond that.
Okay. Maybe as a next step, you mentioned some of those kind of government institutions there. In Ireland, we'd be familiar with the Dáil and the Seanad. The US, they would have the House of Representatives and the Senate. The UK would House of Commons and the House of Lords. What's the arrangement in China? What are are there equivalent institutions or?
Well, as I said, and there's always this useful diagrams on the internet that you can find, but the system works as a two pyramids essentially. You have the party and the state. So you have the National People's Congress and the National Party Congress. So they're the two kind of echelons. And to get elected to either of them, if you want to get elected, you have to be a party member for the party, National Party Congress. You have to be a party member. So there's 96.7 million members. I don't know, it changes every year because it's that big. You have people dying. It's quite a big party. So it's in my lifetime, it's been over 100 million down to 90 million. It changes over time. And they can elect people into the grassroots organizations, they're supposed to elect people to the National People's Congress, and that's how it's supposed to work all the way up, and they eventually appoint the General Secretary. But in reality, the party works, the General Secretary determines who's going to be appointed to the standing committee of the proletariat. The proletariat then they determine the 25 people who will be elected to that, and they determine the people who will be elected to the proletariat standing committee, to the central committee, and then that's kind of rubber stamped by the National Party Congress.
And the General Secretary is also sometimes called the paramount leader. Is that correct?
No.
Difference?
Well, see, this is the thing about China. I think the thing that people, it doesn't really matter what your title is. It doesn't actually determine if you're in charge or not. As I said, Ding never held the title, but he was in charge. So you have these two elements, the state. So the state also has like a national People's Congress that the party has about 2/3 of the membership. Then you have other political parties, and you have technocrats who are members of the National Party or People's Congress, and they also elect the Central Committee and the proletariat, etc. But they're pretty much mapped onto each other, and the National Party's Congress doesn't determine it. So once you have the General Secretary and the standing proletariat appointed, there's two other important institutions. One is the Central Military Commission. Okay. So you have the party's Central Military Commission, and you have the Central Military Commission, so the state's one, but they're identical structures. And whoever is the chairperson of the Central Military Commission, that's who's in charge of China.
And my understanding is that the military, the People's Liberation Army, is the army of the party, not the army of the state. Is that correct?
Well, it started off as the army of the party, and officially it is the army of the state, but it is a wing of it is also the army of the party. So that it's I think you're working on a binary system that doesn't necessarily always apply to Chinese politics. You know, one doesn't necessarily neglect the other, and they both are. It exists as both at the same time.
You talked there about electing people into the various bodies, and sometimes the Chinese Communist Party describe their system of government as whole process democracy. Again, we look at it when we hear about democracy. We look at it through the Western lens. There's many international institutions that have a democracy index, for example, like Freedom House, and they rate China's democracy at 9 out of 100. Like North Korea would be 3 out of 100, whereas many European countries would be much higher, above 90. Like Ireland would be 97 out of 100. So, when they talk about whole process democracy, is it just a propaganda term, or does it actually mean something akin to democracy as we understand it?
Well, I'm guessing what you're referring to is liberal democratic systems, which is what we have here. I've never really understood the term whole process democracy, to be honest. It's not something that I really can describe in great detail. China's not a liberal democracy. It doesn't have separation of powers. There was often the attempt to move or to separate the party and the state was seen by some scholars as a attempt to separate powers, but there isn't a separation of powers between the different wings of the political structure in China, like the judiciary, the legislature, the executive. As Xi said, the party leads all in that sense. There are elections in the kind of broad sense of things at the grassroots level, district, village level. People are elected to be the representative at the village for the state, and there are people elected by party members to be the party representative of the state. They then theoretically are the ones who vote for the every other echelons. They vote people into the provincial level. The provincial level votes into the National People's Congress, and so on and so on. How many people can actually run? Who's allowed to run at different levels is a different question altogether. And you talk about people talk about China as a kind of China, but it's not a monolithic. It's it's not a homogenized place. It's very different depending on where you go, and there's different varieties of how free these elections are and how able people are to express their view on different issues. But legally, there are forms of election in China.
And we see some of these, I mean, Chinese television and so on will show some pictures of voting at the two sessions or the third plenum or these gatherings of the party congress in the Great Hall of the People. Often this voting is very one-sided. There's no dissension. It's literally all 2,900 and whatever number of people present vote the same way.
I mean,
wouldn't you expect to have one or two with different opinions in that body?
It depends on what they're what you're expecting from the system. I mean, the system is structured as a Marxist-Leninist structure, and it's based on the idea of democratic centralism. So they're voting exactly how you would expect them to vote within the system. Democratic centralism requires debate and discussion, in theory, before a vote is taken. If it's going to be, if once it's determined that's the majority of what people, the majority of that's the decision the majority are going to take, then everybody is supposed to roll behind it. And what you see on television is just for television. It's just a show. But they're, like, in theory, under centralized democracy, or it's supposed to be this idea that you have free discussions and debate within the decision-making body, and then once the decision is made, there's not supposed to be anybody fighting against it. It's supposed to be everybody rolls behind it. The question becomes, do you actually have free and open discussion? Or is it just that the higher-ups determine the decision and everybody is supposed to roll behind it? I mean, I don't know. I don't have access to... I've never been invited to the Great Hall of the People for a discussion, and so my feeling would be that there probably isn't that much, but that's just a feeling. I don't have any direct facts on it, but that's how the system is supposed to work.
So Xi Jinping is the current leader. I believe the term paramount leader does apply to him. I mean, he controls the party, the government, the military, pretty much everything. What do we know about his background and how he came to power?
His background is that he is the child of one of the core leadership from the early echelons of the party, who was purged later on in the party. During the Cultural Revolution, he was sent to the countryside, which would be the term for young people who were sent to live in villages towards the end of the Cultural Revolution. He applied for membership of the Communist Party, I think 7 or 8 times, and was turned down, and eventually worked his way up from being a village level party secretary through different provincial jobs to eventually becoming the general secretary of the party. But he is both the president and the general secretary of the party. It's not always the case that people hold both positions, and he has been voted in for a third term into.
Is he leader for life, do you think?
Nobody ever. It's the Chinese Communist Party. He will be the leader as long as it suits the Chinese Communist Party.
What do you think are maybe some of the major changes that have happened in his term so far?
Like, I think one thing that people don't fully gather about Xi's leadership is that he is very much a Marxist-Leninist leader in that sense. He is. He believes that the party should structure itself based on those lines in terms of party governance. He looks back to many of the early kind of political philosophers that came out of the party. Not so much Mao, but some of the others, particularly on structuring of the party itself. And he believes that the party should organize itself based on those structures. And when he came into the party, you have to remember it was around the time of the Arab Spring, and it was also the time you had quite a number of corruption cases, quite high-profile corruption cases in China at the time. So he also believes quite heavily in party discipline, which is something that he has brought back in. But I mean, the whole point of a Marxist-Leninist system is that they are the vanguard of the people, that they're supposed to be involved and lead everywhere within the state, so that you have party structures in everything, private businesses, public businesses, and so the return of the party to non-party organizations, back to the return of the party to the state. So that's kind of what he has kind of driven, and that's taken different forms, and it's very different to what had been under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, which was seen as this kind of collective leadership model.
So are we seeing much more of a cult establishing around Xi Jinping? I mean, he's got his Xi Jinping thought book, or books that I believe are taught in school to 6-year-olds, and is very much recommended.
Yeah, I mean, it's Xi Jinping thoughts on, which is slightly different to so it's Xi Jinping thoughts on socialism with Chinese characteristics. So it's a series of essays on particular subjects, which is a very nerdy breakdown to the difference between Mao thought and Xi Jinping thoughts on. So it's slightly different, but his ideas have been institutionalized into the party, so they're part of the party's constitution, and they've been put into the party's constitution. So that's kind of a sign that it's not only is it something that you should follow, but it's something that should guide the party beyond Xi himself, which is something similar to Mao. Cult of personality and these elements. It's probably something that it has all the hallmarks of it. I don't know if it's necessarily there yet.
I mean, there are China watchers who will say that he's mentioned in the front pages of all the state newspapers every day. News bulletins are about him, and other happenings get a cursory mention. These type of things.
Yeah, I mean I don't know, for me that's just quite superficial stuff. It's not something that I'm entirely too interested in. If you, I mean, that's, if you have a passing interest in Chinese political stuff, that's, he appears in the media quite a lot. What you have to look at is, what is he actually, is he affecting change within the state, so that more power is determined on an individual. So cult of personality is, I mean, it's quite interesting to look at from the point of view of, you see the stuff at Mao with posters and T-shirts and stuff, but it's for me, I don't know, it's not something I'm particularly interested in.
Okay. In terms of affecting things in the state, though, I mean, he's certainly being heavy-handed on corruption crackdowns, no doubt about it. We've seen Qin Gang and Li Shangfu, his foreign minister and head of the military, disappear. We don't know if they face a trial or what. They've just disappeared. But I suppose in terms of more things that might affect the Chinese people would be, he claims to have raised people out of poverty, or at least his contribution to the work of the Chinese Communist Party have raised people out of poverty. What's your assessment of that? I mean, is that
that's I mean, it depends what you mean by poverty, and it depends what you mean by raise somebody out of it. So I mean, it's up to a state to determine what they measure as poverty. So you could set poverty measure at the World
Yeah.
Bank poverty measure, and yeah, they've done it. But it depends. It doesn't mean that people's lives are necessarily improved by a particular mark.
Right. I mean,
every
their poverty level is $160 a month.
Yeah.
If you earn more than that, if you have more income than that, you're not in poverty.
so but again, this is like it depends how the state measures it. So every leader has claimed that he's raised people out of poverty in China. So it's kind of it's not something I pay a lot of attention to, and any leader from any country tells me that, because unless it's a specific measure of relevant poverty. So if it's but if you look at what he actually has done within the political system, which is that's quite profound in terms of the impact, because he has eradicated or he has merged things that were party disciplinary bodies or party bodies for overseeing something, or things that were solely state bodies into individual elements. So, for example, the party disciplinary body, he's merged that with the National Security Commission, I think it was called before, which meant that if the state is investigating corruption by somebody, it's that the party is investigating it to a certain extent. Okay. He's required any body or any institution that has more than X number of party members has to have a party cell in it, which means that you have like private companies that now require to have party organizations within them, and that has a profound impact on people's day-to-day lives, because you have the party now operating in private institutions. It has an effect on universities because they have to required to have it, which means then there's monitoring of people's discussions in around how they are implementing things like Xi Jinping thought, and discussing them. So it's I mean, when you talk about people's material wealth or something like that, that's something, and raising things out of poverty, it's something you have to take with a pinch of salt anywhere.
But I mean, that's an interesting point you mentioned, the kind of China, the Communist Party's monitoring of business and involvement in companies and universities and so on.
Where previously a company had been a private company, and it still legally is a private company, yes. That's separate to the state, right? So the party wouldn't have had involvement in it. Now the party is involved in both a private company and a state company, but in terms of having a presence there, whereas they previously wouldn't have had in the private companies, they always would have had in the state companies.
So companies like Huawei, TikTok, ByteDance, the parent, they all have Chinese Communist Party present in their bases in China, according to this.
I have no idea. I'm just I can't confirm that one way or the other. I'm just saying that that is one of the things that has been is a development that's different.
You mentioned how the party now has presence in private companies. So I'm trying to understand, what is the goal of that? For the party, why? Why do they need to monitor all of that? Why this close coupling?
In that sense, the part of the reason for it is that you have to think that, like, there's one rule for studying Chinese politics or understanding Chinese politics, is that the party will do whatever the party needs to survive. So,
party's number one.
Party's number one, and it's beyond Xi Jinping, it's beyond Mao, it's beyond anybody. So the party will try to survive beyond everything. And one of the things that the party fears is power outside of the party. Yes. And one thing where people will develop, you study capitalism in any country, one of the areas that power develops outside of the political system is through when people develop wealth independently. They can sponsor types of education in universities. They can create newspapers. They can sponsor art or books. So it's a form of power outside the control of the state. And Jiang Zemin tried to co-opt private enterprises and entrepreneurs into the party by giving them party membership, and that has been in some ways successful. And now, as more and more people work in the private sector rather than the public sector, this is an area where the party doesn't have full control, and that's why they are pushing in these particular elements.
And maybe just one other thing, just to kind of fill the picture on that, is, regarding the media. So how the media operates here in the West, they're free to investigate, discuss, criticize, and so on. Can you tell us how it works in China?
Well, I'm not an expert in Chinese media by any means. There's some excellent scholars doing work on that. You have local and national newspapers. You have think tanks. You have research centres. You have formal censorship laws, which means that people can't publish on X, Y, and Z. And then you have informal censorship laws where people kind of self-regulate about what they're actually going to report. The vast majority of investigative journalism takes place with online blogs and people using kind of false identities and these kind of things. Those people are often censored when caught. But a lot of it is as much to do with self-censorship or trying to work within particular boundaries. I mean, it's a dangerous place to be a journalist. It's a dangerous place to be a journalist in general in the world. If you look at all the indicators, and most journalists will tell you that they try to play. They know the boundaries of how far they can go and talk, which is why all journalists who deal with China have a responsibility to take into account the people in China, that they can put them into danger when discussing these elements. And we do have to be careful about what we say if we have friends and contacts in China, because they might be self-censoring. Then it's up to us to kind of maintain a certain amount of understanding of that as well.
Okay. So maybe last or penultimate question. In your own research, you've studied Sino-African relations and China's Belt and Road Initiative. So for people who may have heard of it but not know what it is, what is the Belt and Road Initiative?
The Belt and Road Initiative is it was launched in 2013, and it is kind of a combination of two things: pre-existing investments and aid projects that were initiated both by private and public Chinese companies. So it was an attempt to bring together a variety of different overseas activities by the Chinese government. So development aid projects, investment projects, and that was to kind of centralize it quite a bit, which is part of Xi's overall pattern of behavior as a leader, is kind of to centralize control around these kind of elements. And it was a way of presenting these investments and these donations as part of a coherent plan, because before that, under Hu and under Jiang Zemin, that when companies went abroad or when China was giving development aid abroad, there was a lot of kind of bureaucratical conflicts between different elements of the Chinese state. So you'd have the Ministry for Foreign Affairs doing something, and the Ministry for Commerce doing something else, and the Ministry for Culture doing something else, and not necessarily complementing each other sometimes. And then you'd have private actors doing something else. And the Belt and Road Initiative was this idea to try to coordinate a better coordination of all these different Chinese actors. So if Chinese companies investing abroad, they can get a loan from the Chinese Export Bank under the Belt and Road Initiative, and this would allow them a greater interconnectivity of different investments. So the Belt and Road is often presented in the media as this huge infrastructural projects with trains and roads and rail networks being invested. But it goes beyond that. There's health investment aspects to it. There is aspects around digitalization, these kind of elements. And it's it has a maritime aspect and a road aspect, and the maritime aspect is mainly what affects Africa, but it's kind of gone beyond that over the period of time.
Quite a few African countries have participated. Can you share any insights into like how it's working out there, or what the impact of it is?
Again, it's a massive topic. You have it in general. You have countries that have become quite involved in it in terms of using it to build long needed infrastructure projects, roads and rail networks, ports in particular in Africa. It's been successful in some senses that the infrastructure has been put in place, particularly ITC sectors in terms of building communication networks. So you have companies like Huawei and ZTC building the networks that are often quite needed, and that's not necessarily anything to do with the Belt and Road, but it's often pushed under it. You in that sense, it's been successful. There's been lots of complicated issues around how the money is delivered and where it goes to. That's as much to do with internal issues within the African states, and this kind of perception that this is free money when often it's not. There's commercial loans to it. It has to be paid back. Collateral, because of structuring of Chinese loans from banks, collateral is asked for, and often China ends up with things that they don't necessarily want, and then it's presented as something that
debt trap diplomacy.
Debt trap diplomacy, which is something that you'll often hear in the media, which is not necessarily a good description of what it is. Because often these loans are simply restructured over longer periods of time. This isn't me trying to defend Chinese investment in these countries or trying to say everything is hunky-dory, because it often you are heaping debt onto countries that don't necessarily have the ability to ever pay it back. But it's also not this thing where they're tricking countries into capturing their ports, because often these are things that they don't. These are commercial loans that have to be paid back commercially, and it's not necessarily good for the banks either to gather these. It's presented quite often as strategic resources being captured.
Exactly. But, minerals and mining resources, things like that.
Yeah, in some cases there was before the Belt and Road, and this is where a lot of it comes from. You had the Angola model, which was this idea that debt would be paid back with oil, and this is again what is often replenished in areas and repeated as that must be the model that's happening. It's slightly more complex than that. Some countries are trying to pay back debt with minerals. But it's often paying it back on the receipts of those minerals, not with the minerals directly. It differs from country to country. There are definitely cases where it's taking place, but that doesn't necessarily mean it represents the whole thing. Like talking about Africa it's 54 countries. Sure. It's not to say that it happens, but debt trap diplomacy is probably not a good analogy for it. And people often see conspiracy in things that are grand strategies and things that are not necessarily always there. There's poor management of the loans given over, and a lack of consideration of the ability of people to pay it back. And then there's often a scramble to try to fix that, because it's politically it's politically uncomfortable for the Chinese government to be seen as a colonial country taking land. So then the commercial loan, which was a commercial loan, suddenly there's a political pressure to turn it into something that it wasn't.
And some final thoughts from Dr. Niall Duggan.
It's studying China it's something that often people have this view of it coming from the media, and it's a much more complex place than that, and it's an extremely diverse country where people actually do have a variety of different political views of the country, and it's I think people need a kind of a nuanced view of that when looking at politics in China. And that doesn't mean that to side one way or the other with the Communist Party or anything like that, but you can't really understand the Communist Party unless you understand the relationship that it has with the people, particularly things like mass line movements or united fronts. These are all complicated terms, but when you begin to look at that's one of the ways the party communicates with the people and vice versa, but it can also be understood as a way of the party trying to influence people through things like Xi thought, etc. But I think that's probably a lesson for us all for another day.
That's Dr. Niall Duggan, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Government and Politics at University College Cork. And my thanks to him for sharing his valuable insights and taking the time to talk with us on Perspectives with Neilo. If you're interested in hearing more about the Chinese Communist Party, we'd also encourage you to check out some of our other episodes, like Beijing Rules with Bethany Allen, or China Wake Up Call with Professor Andrew Cotty. And you can find these and all of our past episodes at pwneilo.com or by searching for Perspectives with Neilo wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to give us a like, follow or subscribe if you enjoy our content. But that's where we leave it for the moment. As always, thank you for listening, and until the next time, slán agus beannacht.